Hi, my name is Holly Reid, and this is my presentation on the tragic balancing acts of gender. For this year's symposium, I will be presenting my ideas for my paper. The goal of my paper will be to explore the use of character traits in tragedy and how they affect and relate to the representation of women in tragedy. There will be a focus on how the actions of women are represented and connect to the non-existent idea of a balanced woman in tragedy. Before understanding how gender is broken up in tragedy, there needs to be a basic understanding of what Greek tragedy is. Greek tragedy is a unique form of drama created around the 6th century BCE, in the classical period of ancient Greece. What made tragedy a unique form of drama was its focus on tragic and disturbing sociological ideas and its retelling of myths, as will be discussed later when diving deeper into the tragedies focused on in this presentation. Tragedies were performed at the Dionysia, an annual festival put on in Athens. Some of the most famous Greek tragedians, whose works survive to this day, are Euripides, Sophocles, and Aeschylus. These tragedians created beautiful works of fiction that, whether consciously or not, comment on the ideas of gender in society. The works of these tragedians will be the focus of this presentation. To fully understand the genre of Greek tragedy, one needs to consider where and when tragedies were created, as well as the perspective taken by the author. Knowing this information allows scholars to understand what influenced the authors. As mentioned before, tragedies were written by aristocratic men in the classical period of ancient Greece. Classical Athens ushered in a new era of democracy that should have been inclusive, but instead, only male citizens were given voting privileges, leaving women, slaves, and foreigners as the non-voting majority. Misogynistic rhetoric did not first come into existence with democracy in the classical period. Epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey, created during the Archaic period, only a few hundred years before the classical period, had misogynistic views on women throughout their texts. Even though it was not the first occurrence of it, the misogynistic way society was set up in classical Athens affects the way women were depicted in these tragedies. While not a new concept, misogynistic ideas were more intense and referenced much more often throughout tragedies. For example, Euripides mentions the plight of women throughout Medea, such as when he mentions the separate living quarters made for women and a woman's lack of autonomy. Euripides drew from his own experience living in Athens and what he has seen there in order to shed light on the veiling of women. Understanding where the author's bias in their writing originates becomes really important in understanding the tragedies they create. Now that there is an understanding of what tragedy is and where it is located in history, we move on to look at what gender is. Gender is explained as the social and cultural construction of masculinity and femininity, encapsulating ideas that men and women have fundamental differences that separate them in society. An example of this is how we associate being a doctor as a masculine profession and a nurse as a feminine profession, despite them both specializing in medicine of the human body and there being no gender requirement for either position. Sex is a word that can have a multitude of meanings, but for the purpose of this presentation, sex will be used to describe the character's sexual anatomy, the gender that they are represented as in the tragedy. The separation of gender and sex was not a common idea in classical Athens. One was born male or female, and that was their designated gender. Misogynistic gendering was also very common, as we discussed in my explanation of classical Athens. This gives us a better understanding of the representation of men and women in these ancient tragedies. Gender traits are an important part of my paper, and throughout this presentation there will be examples of gender traits and how they are used in tragedy. But for now, it is important to have a base understanding of what gender traits are. Gender traits refer to characteristics that are commonly associated with specific gender stereotypes. The use of gender traits was a common occurrence in antiquity and still is today. An example of a gender trait is an association of emotional traits like nurturing and wiliness with femininity, and traits like strength and stoicism with masculinity. They are stereotypes that are related to gender with no reason other than misogynistic societal ideas. Gender traits are an important feature of tragedy. They emerge through tragic works through the means of exaggerating noble characters and vilifying women. These tropes are central to tragedy and show themselves through the characters' gender traits. Tyrannical noble characters are often shown having too much of one trait that usually plays a part in their downfall. These characters were usually depicted as being overly masculine and would not have been viewed positively in antiquity. As will be discussed in this presentation, female characters are usually portrayed as causing tragic events to occur and are characterized very negatively throughout the presentation. These ideas that flow through tragedy are important to keep in mind as well. Before getting into the mechanics of tragic character, I want to relay the storylines of the main tragedies in my paper. The tragedies are Euripides' Bacchae, Medea, and Electra, as well as Aeschylus' Oresteia, particularly the libation bearer. Firstly, Euripides' Bacchae follows the story of Pentheus and his hubristic denial of Dionysus, the god of wine, and his power. Characters like Tiresias chime in to persuade the king of Thebes to respect Dionysus, but in the end, Pentheus' lack of respect kills him. Throughout the tragedy, Dionysus has a cult of women referred to as the Bacchae. The Bacchae contain the aristocratic women of Thebes, one being Pentheus' mother, Agave. At the end of the tragedy, Agave and the other Bacchae murder Pentheus in a dark feminine rage brought on by Dionysus. Euripides' Medea follows the story of Medea as she gets revenge on her husband Jason. Jason dishonors their marriage by taking a new wife, Glauce, for her kingdom. Medea enacts this revenge by murdering Glauce and her own children by Jason. Her goal in all of this was to take away Jason's future and legacy. Aeschylus' Oresteia is the surviving trilogy which follows Clytemnestra's murder of her husband and later Orestes' murder of his mother. In my paper, I will focus on Aeschylus' libation bearers because it features Electra more heavily. I will be referring to Euripides' Electra as well, which follows the same idea as Aeschylus' libation bearers. The only major difference between the stories is Electra's role in killing her mother, Clytemnestra, as we will see in my presentation. To illustrate how gender traits interact with characters in tragedy, I will outline the representation of men and women using the characters Pentheus, Tiresias, Medea, the Bacchae, and Electra. Pentheus, Tiresias, and the Bacchae all come from Euripides' Bacchae, as mentioned earlier. Looking at men and gender balance, we see an easy trend to follow. Overly masculine men are tyrants. They are selfish, unyielding, and quick to anger. As mentioned in my section on tragic tropes, the tyrant is a familiar character trope in tragedy. The tyrant character is punished for its excessive nature. Their excessiveness comes from their inability to accept their masculine or feminine qualities. Pentheus is an excellent example of men repressing a certain gender trait category and getting punished for it. Pentheus was the king of Thebes and was unable to accept his feminine qualities, resulting in his despising femininity. Pentheus' hate for femininity is really just a mask for his longing for it. Pentheus suppresses his femininity, but as he begins to act on his desires, he begins to enjoy aspects of femininity like wearing a dress and putting on makeup. Pentheus' expressed traits are all masculine, and because he is avoiding his feminine traits, his masculine ones are then exaggerated. Pentheus is overly direct, aggressive, and stubborn. He happily voices his hubristic hate for the god Dionysus, aggressively imprisons the Bacchae, and he refuses to back down from hunting and killing the Bacchae after they escape imprisonment. Pentheus' over-exaggerated masculinity and his inability to embrace femininity is what eventually leads to his death. Tiresias was a frail old seer and a sympathetic character in antiquity. Tiresias acts as a voice of reason for Pentheus in Euripides' Bacchae. Tiresias is able to embrace both femininity and masculinity, having feminine traits like emotional intelligence, patience, and obedience, as well as masculine traits like reason, directness, and male status. Tiresias has the ability to be direct when voicing his concerns about Pentheus's actions, but he also shows obedience by backing away when it is clear to him that Pentheus will not heed his advice. Having two types of gendered traits allows Pentheus to see clearly and take action and helps him avoid irrational behaviors. Even the chorus in Euripides' play refers to Tiresias as a man of wisdom and sense, driving home Tiresias' vantage as a balanced man and how the character was praised in antiquity. There are two types of trait-based men in tragedy, a balanced one and an unbalanced one. The balanced one acts with grace and thought and is praised for his level-headedness. The unbalanced man acts in an over-exaggerated way and is never able to be balanced. A key point to notice in the portrayal of a tragic man is his control. Both Tiresias and Pentheus have control over their actions and choice. Both murder the Bacchae or don't. A great example of this is the representation of Pentheus' grandfather Cadmus, as he follows and listens to Tiresias, choosing not to act as his grandson. Though he is a king, he is able to overcome his over-exaggerated gender associated with kings. He is what Pentheus would have been had he decided against his over-exaggerated ways. We will see that being able to make a choice and have control over one's actions is a privilege these tragic men hold that the women do not. When we look at how gender imbalance, features, and attributes are depicted in female characters, it is very convoluted. Tragedies depict women as excessive beings, and there is no depiction of a purely balanced woman. Medea is the closest female character to a balanced woman, but she isn't quite there. While she has both feminine and masculine qualities, her masculine qualities overpower her feminine ones. This creates a type of tainted femininity in the portrayal of women in these tragedies. Medea has similarities to masculine characters in that she is headstrong and vengeful. Meanwhile, she also has feminine traits because she is beautiful, caring, and patient. The outcome of this nearly balanced woman is tainted by fear. Unlike Tiresias, Medea becomes a manipulator. She corrupts balance with her femininity. In Euripides' Medea, Creon, an Athenian king, describes Medea as a clever woman skilled in many evil wiles. The way Creon explains her intelligence as clever gives it a menacing note, not to mention calling the cleverness evil and insinuating its femininity with the term wiles. Medea's masculine traits are then tainted by her femininity. There is a similar representation of femininity being tainted in the portrayal of Electra by Euripides, as you will see. The Bacchae represent women being overcome by their repressed masculinity, and similarly to Medea, the Bacchae masculine urges come off very tainted. They become frenzied and one with nature in a very dark and animalistic way, as explained in Euripides' Bacchae. The Bacchae lose all feminine traits when entering their frenzied state, and similar to Pentheus, the masculine traits are then over-exaggerated. The difference between the Bacchae and Pentheus is that the Bacchae lose full control in their frenzied state, as well as their ability to eventually overcome it. Pentheus never overcomes his feminine suppression. Even when he embraces femininity, he is then disregarding masculinity by over-exaggerating his connection to femininity. The Bacchae become frenzied and animalistic and then revert back to consciousness. This connection to women as animalistic beasts plays a big role in how the Bacchae are represented and how women are seen. There's always a possibility she will become a beast, because that is what women are. Electra is a character in tragedy that has two major depictions. One is in Euripides' Electra, where she is depicted negatively, and the other is in Aeschylus' Oresteia, more specifically the libation bearers, where she is depicted positively. The Electra which Euripides depicts in his tragedy is similar to how he depicts Medea, bringing in this idea of tainted femininity. She shows masculine traits of stubbornness and bloodlust as well as feminine traits of modesty and virtue. In Euripides' Electra, Clytemnestra refers to her daughter as stubborn, and throughout the act of the play, you see Electra's inability to move on hurt her. She lets the hate for her mother cloud her judgment, and she does something she later regrets. Her inability to move on leads to her pressuring her brother into continuing with the murder. She is too stubborn, and it involves making her a killer. Her modesty is not enough to combat her stubbornness. The Electra in Aeschylus' Libation Bearers is depicted as passive. She has no masculine qualities. She is depicted purely in a feminine form. The base of this Electra is how gentle and subordinate she is. She is overly submissive in a lot of ways, merely following the lead of her brother Orestes every chance she gets. She is not a balanced woman, yet she would be considered a good woman in antiquity. Her over-exaggerated femininity is not tainted in any way, unlike the depiction of Medea or the depiction of Euripides' version of Electra. We see Electra get praised many times in Libation Bearers for her over-feminine persona. The main focus of my paper is to understand how women in tragedy are portrayed through gender traits. That aspect of my paper will be explored in this section of my presentation, as I explore the plight of tragic women. As we saw earlier, balance is central to manhood. It is what makes a man rational. It is something that elevates men. Tragedians didn't portray women as balanced. Instead, masculinity continues to taint the portrayal of tragic women. Balance becomes dangerous in the context of women. Even when masculine traits are introduced into a female character like Medea, it quickly takes over and the woman becomes tainted. The outcome could emerge for many reasons. Balance equals a type of intelligence, and intelligence equals power. So balance is power to the Greeks. Despite its reasoning, we see a trend in the Greek tragedy of villainizing balanced women and praising the repression of masculine qualities in women. As mentioned earlier, tragic men have control over their actions and what they want to do, which is not the same for women. Women are rarely in control of themselves, as represented in the portrayal of the Bacchae. While in their frenzied state, they have no control over who they hurt and what they do. When a woman is in control, like Medea, she makes an over-exaggerated, crazy choice like murdering her own children in order to hurt her husband. As explained earlier, women are tainted by masculinity. A woman being tainted could be due to her inability to handle masculinity. A woman can't control her masculine urges because she is unbalanced, as we saw in Euripides' Bacchae. In order for a woman to gain control, she needs to be following a man, which isn't real control. In essence, what makes a good woman is her not having any control in her life, because she can never be in control of herself. Instead, we see depictions of good women as following the direction of men. For example, Electra is depicted as a good woman through Aeschylus' Libation Bearers because she follows her brother Orestes. By following Orestes, Electra does not have control, which makes her masculine urges unable to take over. This is in contrast to Electra in Euripides' portrayal, where she acts as a lead character and she is active in the murder, meaning she essentially has a form of control, but it is the tainted form of it that the tragedians use to portray women as incapable of being in control. How women are portrayed in tragedy is as never being able to handle masculinity. They always have a need to be masculine, like the Bacchae, but always become tainted in some way by submasculinity, which then leads to a woman following a man and losing control because she can't handle it. The depiction of woman in tragedy is complicated, but I hope my presentation has informed you of the ideas associated with gender in tragedy and how the portrayal of simple traits can affect how gender itself is understood. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my symposium presentation.